Yeah, I'm actually glad that you remembered to do this because this will, everything we just did was mostly review, and this is new stuff for the people on Kairos, as well as for Gwenny, who is still absent.
Miss you, Gwenny.
Yeah, we miss you, Gwenny. I hope you're feeling better.
Oh.
Has anybody heard from her?
No.
Kind of.
Okay.
So she had a cold, and then she wasn't feeling the best still. And then the day she was gonna come back to school, she found out she had COVID. So she just kind of got back-to-back illnesses. So.
Okay.
What's up, Gwenny?
By the way, guys, when we are looking at the business cycle, all this is going to make total sense to you in terms of like, yeah, duh, when the economy is going through a recession, unemployment increases and output decreases. So a lot of it is pretty straightforward, logical reasoning stuff. And this is just a little bit of history about how we get to macroeconomics as an academic discipline. So the business cycle is the alternation between output contractions and expansions, or recessions and expansions. Not every contraction is a recession, okay? And you guys have probably noticed that. The economy sometimes is like chugging along, it's doing really great, and other times people are worried about their jobs, worried about the future, worried about prices, etc. Okay, and so during and after the Great Depression, economists were really trying to tackle not only how can we measure this and be more on top of this, but also can we do something about it? Are there policies that we can put in place to try to smooth those out a little bit, okay? Recessions are periods of economic downturns when output and employment are falling. A depression is a very deep and prolonged downturn. Expansions are sometimes called recoveries. They're periods of economic upturns when output and employment are rising. Now, there is an official definition of a recession that you should know. A recession is officially called a recession when there are 2 consecutive quarters, that means 6 months in a row, where real GDP is declining. Okay, Safa? Yes. The official definition of a recession, the Bureau of Economic Statistics, is 2 consecutive quarters, aka 6 months in a row, where real GDP is declining. I wanted to distinguish that between a contraction. Every once in a while, we'll get a month or 2 months even where real GDP dips, but then it comes back up. That's not a recession. That's a slight contraction, and then we're back, okay? A recession is more than that. 6 months in a row of negative real GDP growth, or real GDP is declining, okay? There's no official definition of a depression. It's one of those things where you kind of like, you know it when you're in it, and you can look at it from kind of in the rearview mirror. And actually, a recession is something where economists are looking in the rearview mirror. Sometimes we feel it first. We felt it first in the recession that occurred in 2008 and 9. You knew it was happening even before the government officially, stamped it a recession. And that's because why? Why do you think that is? Why do we sometimes not know we're in a recession until many, many months after it's already started? What do you think? Because we need the data from the base year, right? So we've got to, like, all that information's coming in, but economists don't necessarily know. Is this just prices? Is this something else? Like, we think we might be in a recession, but they're not going to know for sure until they can look back in the rearview mirror at that 6 month period and say, yes, real GDP has declined for all those 6 months, and we know that because we compared that with using base period prices. Does that make sense? Okay. So sometimes you know you're in a recession before it is officially labeled one. All right, so this is what a business cycle looks like graphically. You've got real GDP on the vertical, and you've got time on the horizontal. And it's like, it's this, right? It's up and down. During an expansion, it's coming up. Then you hit the peak. Then you get a contraction or a recession. You hit the trough, that's the low point, and then you're back up. You might be asking yourself, what sets these in motion? What causes a recession? Anybody have any guesses? Anybody? Take a wild guess. Why do you think a recession could get kicked into motion? Sometimes it's just about demographics. Sometimes it's just, for example, in the 80s, we had a period of economic boom after 1982, and it was because that's when all the baby boomers were getting to the age where they were buying houses, buying new cars, having families, having to buy a lot of stuff for them, right? They were getting into their peak earning years, so they're spending a lot of money. They were increasing C by a lot. And then right after the boomers is my generation, Generation X. We're a very small group. And so we did less of that. So we had some contractions with the Generation X people when they were getting to that age group. Okay? Now the boomers are going to increase government spending because they are all going into Social Security and getting on Medicare because they're now retired, right? And they're costing, anyway, I don't want to get into all that, but the point is sometimes it's demographics. So sometimes it's about population groups that already exist within our country. Sometimes it's about migration. Sometimes it's just about what's called consumer sentiment or economic sentiment. It's like a feeling. Like all of a sudden people start to lose confidence. And that could be because of the politicians who are in office or who's head of the Fed and what the decisions that they're making. It could have to do with changes in technology, with like AI. Right now, the explosion of AI is prompting an expansion in our economy because at least right now, it's changing the way businesses do business. It's creating new economic opportunities for businesses, and it hasn't replaced too many people's jobs yet. Okay? All right. So this is just a look at like the terms, right? And I want you guys to pay attention to the fact that as real GDP is dipping and climbing and dipping and climbing, it is correlated with higher levels of unemployment and lower levels of employment, okay? It's not always true, but usually they are correlated, okay? Business cycles are kicked off. They start, a new cycle starts when we go into a recession, okay? So that starts a new business cycle. There have been 12 recessions since World War II. The average lasts 11 months, or almost a year. And one of the biggest goals is to identify when it's happening so that the government or the Fed or both can put policies into place to get us towards the upswing. Because the other thing is, like, economists do not want to see a business cycle that looks like this, right? They want to see this, smooth but moving up along with our potential output. Why wouldn't they want to see those high peaks? What do you think?
I think the more drastic the turns are, the more drastic solutions you have to resort to.
Yes, that's one cost for sure. Any other ideas? Mary?
Oh no,
No, you're just taking your pencil and putting it in your face, thinking. Very, very high peaks usually are correlated with very high inflation. So it tends to work against one of the goals of our economy, which is price stability. It's also destabilizing for business contracts. Like what is happening in this economy, right? When people don't feel like things are stable, they don't want to invest. Okay. And this is, again, just kind of like correlating the unemployment rate with periods of recession. As I said, they're very, very highly correlated. And I'm just glad we now have a new AP Econ textbook that is newer than 2012 so that we can see more recent data in it. Okay. This is a look at aggregate output. And since the beginning of the 20th century, and definitely since the Great Depression, we've had an average increase in real GDP of about 3% every year. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, sometimes we have a recession, but generally speaking, about 3% a year. And economic growth is only measured in real GDP. Okay, not nominal, just real. Because it's about how much are we making and how much is being is consumed, right? Or purchased, either by firms, the government, or consumers, or the rest of the world for that matter, okay? Okay. Let's talk about, this is the most difficult part. The difference between actual output and potential output. We saw that unemployment rate's never going to be zero, right? We're always going to have some amount of frictional and structural unemployment, and we want there to be a little bit, right? We want there to be a little bit. It creates some of that creative destruction. It makes sure that we have a growing and dynamic economy, okay? The natural rate of unemployment correlates with the full employment level of output. So when we're at full employment, meaning the only kind of unemployment we have is frictional and structural unemployment, okay? That is our level of potential output. That's the best we can do, okay? When we have an employment level of output that is different than potential, we have an output gap. If there's a lot of cyclical unemployment, that is called a recessionary gap, meaning that people are getting laid off because firms don't have enough work to employ them. If we were in an expansion, all those people would be working because they have relevant skills, their work is needed, and they can find a job that meets their qualifications, okay? When we have a positive output gap, meaning we are producing beyond our potential output, that is called an inflationary gap. It means that the economy is demanding more output and we are really struggling to meet that level, okay? That's called an inflationary gap. Now, when we get into our next unit and start evaluating aggregate demand and aggregate supply, you guys are gonna see that like this output gap changes day to day, but we're only gonna be looking at slices of time, okay? So, an important part of this last part, the level of real GDP the economy can produce when all resources are fully employed. That means we are operating on our production possibility frontier. We're at some point on our production possibility frontier. We can operate in an inflationary gap just outside of our production possibility frontier, but that is not sustainable. It's not sustainable because of the labor market limitations, because of resource limitations, etc. And when we're operating inside our production possibility frontier, which we know is inefficient, that is typically a recessionary gap. Not all of our deployed resources are being used efficiently, right? We've got people who are unemployed cyclically. They could be out there working and contributing to the economy, but there's not enough work for them because of what's happening in the business cycle. That's it. That's it for all of the notes for this. How are you guys feeling? Do you have any questions?
What was the positive output gap?
It's an inflationary gap.
That's the positive one?
That's a pause. That means that we are producing at a level beyond our potential output. So it's higher. Real GDP is higher than potential output.
And does the negative one have a name?
Yes, it's a recessionary gap.
Okay.
And that means we are producing below our potential output. Any of you guys who are going to go on in college to study international affairs, you will likely have to take international micro and macro economics. And in international micro, you'll cover a lot about the interaction between our potential output and other countries' potential outputs and how we trade with them. We'll cover it in a very brief and cursory manner in the last unit of this course, but it's super interesting stuff about how we fit with the rest of our trading partners.